So the Great Depression starts off in 1929 when the stock market crashed. You're going to see the economy hit very hard, unemployment soared, a lot of people were out of work, and so the government eventually had to pass a series of laws to deal with this issue. Part of the laws that they passed were laws concerning relief aid, right, so that people can get public assistance to help them survive during this time when they were out of work, okay? And the series of legislation that were passed by the United States government was known as the New Deal. Okay, so the New Deal is huge. There's all kinds of laws that were passed. There's relief aid programs, there's work programs, a number of different work programs that we'll talk about some later that were passed to try to put people to work so that they can earn a living. But for now, let's just focus on some of the relief programs that were passed during this time. Now, the problem with the relief programs was they didn't help migrant workers in many cases, right? And so you have a large amount of Mexican and Mexican Americans who were working as migrant workers during this time. Remember, I was saying there's an increase in migrant workers. So if they were trying to benefit from relief aid programs, they couldn't do it in many cases because they didn't meet the residency requirements. So the thing here is if you were going to apply for public assistance from the government, right, this relief aid, you had to be a resident of a certain area. And migrant workers, because of their jobs, never lived in one place long enough to establish residency. So if they didn't establish residency, they couldn't apply for these programs. They were not eligible for them. So in this way, the New Deal relief aid programs really did not take into account migrant workers. It left them out, and so they suffered. In a sense, this is a form of discrimination because they were not included in these relief aid programs. Okay. Also, in terms of finding work, you have Mexicans and Mexican Americans being excluded from some of the projects that were established by the U.S. government, state governments, and city governments. Right. So in many cases, the cities and states would establish programs for construction jobs, right, to put people to work so they could work in construction. And in many cases, Mexicans and Mexican Americans were excluded from this type of work in order to open more positions for Anglo-Americans. Okay, so you have racism, discrimination taking place in terms of job availability. All right, and so there was a real anti-Mexican movement that was going on during this time in terms of labor, right? Labor organizations such as the Los Angeles Labor Federation were involved in trying to bar Mexicans and Mexican Americans from certain jobs. They did not like the idea that Mexicans and Mexican Americans were taking jobs that could have gone to white men, basically. All right, so just clear racism amongst some of the unions of this time. You also have unions, organized labor, pushing for repatriation during this time, right? Repatriation, remember we talked about before, this is basically deportation of Mexicans during this time. Right, so organized labor is pushing for this. They want deportations so that there aren't as many Mexicans competing for jobs that white people want during this time. Also, another form of discrimination during this time was that many Mexican and Mexican Americans were denied public assistance when funds ran out. Okay, so think of it like this. Say you're in the city, you don't have a job, and you're applying for public assistance, and so is everybody else. Well, eventually the city is going to run out of funds for public assistance, and so in many cases, the first people to be cut from public assistance were Mexicans and Mexican Americans. All right, so you see discrimination taking place there, where they're denied public assistance when funds run out. All right, so as I was saying, labor organizations were really pushing for repatriation during this time, right? The deportation of Mexicans in order to limit competition for work. So let's talk a little bit more about repatriation during the Great Depression. All right, so the U.S. Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1929, and this act basically criminalized illegal immigration by making it a felony. All right. The Immigration Act also allowed for the U.S. government to start federal deportation campaigns, which you would see taking place in the Southwest. The main department in charge of this was the U.S. Bureau of Immigration. As I said, labor unions are involved in pushing for repatriation. So the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, one of the major unions in the United States, was heavily involved in pushing for repatriation. They wanted to get rid of any type of competition coming from Mexicans in looking for work. So the AFL was pushing for stronger restrictions on immigration. And so you're going to see the Bureau of Immigration conducting a number of immigration raids during this time. They had the right to stop anyone who they believed was an illegal alien and ask them if they had proof of citizenship, right? So Mexicans and Mexican Americans had to prove that they were U.S. citizens, or else they would be taken in these immigration raids. The harassment involved with these raids was so high that it caused 1/3 of the Mexican population in Los Angeles to migrate out of the city and go to Mexico, right? Without even being deported. And so basically, you're going to have Mexicans and Mexican Americans being deported during this time because of this deportation campaign that was a part of the Immigration Act of 1929. All right. And so why Mexican Americans? I mean, they're U.S. citizens, right? Well, if they were dark skinned, if they looked like they were immigrants, they could be interrogated. They would be asked for their citizenship papers, their ID. And if they didn't have the proper paperwork, then even Mexican Americans could be deported during this time. So you're going to see a large amount of deportations taking place during the Great Depression, trying to get rid of competition from Mexicans and Mexican Americans during this time. And labor is heavily behind this, as well as the U.S. government. Now, in the Midwest, you would have some Mexicans getting involved in voluntary repatriation during this time. So, for example, in Detroit, there were very high rates of unemployment. And so you would see Mexicans forming an organization called the League of Workers and Peasants. And this organization would help to organize a repatriation program so that Mexicans could leave Detroit and go to Mexico to find work on farms. The famous Mexican muralist Diego Rivera actually played a role in forming this league. He was commissioned at that time to come from Mexico to Detroit to paint a mural for the Detroit Institute of the Arts. And he actually used his money that he made from painting that mural to help create the League of Workers and Peasants, and was involved in the organizing of the repatriation program to help bring Mexicans back to Mexico to find jobs on farm cooperatives. So the repatriation program, the whole aim of it was really to get Mexicans out of the country so that more jobs would be available for Anglo-Americans, right? That was the main objective behind this whole federal repatriation program. But in many cases, the repatriation program was a failure because there were certain weaknesses. Right? For one, it broke apart families. How is that? Well, it's very common in deportation. You have parents who are not U.S. citizens, but they had children while here in the United States. And so their children are U.S. citizens. And so when you have deportation taking place, parents are separated from their children who remain in the U.S. While the parents are deported to Mexico. All right, so you have broken families. So morally, that of course is a weakness of the repatriation program. But there's also an economic weakness to the program. And the economic problem is that when you deport a family member who is pretty much the breadwinner of that family, the one who is earning the income to take care of that family, when you deport that person, you have to pay for the deportation. Right? But not only that, the government is also now going to have to pay for relief aid for their dependents that were left behind, because now they don't have their family member who was earning an income. Right? And so they're going to have to turn to local, state governments, federal government, looking for relief aid. And that's going to cost more money for the government. So in that sense, the repatriation program was a failure, because it costs way more money than was expected, because you have these dependents who were left behind who are now filing for relief aid, whereas they probably wouldn't have if their family member would not have been deported. Okay. Another weakness of the repatriation program was the fact that many of these people who were deported would eventually come back into the United States anyway. So all that money used for deporting them and then for relief aid for their dependents was pretty much pointless because they're going to come back into the U.S. anyway. Why? Because they have family members who are U.S. residents. All right. And so if you have a family member who is a U.S. resident at this time, then you get special preference for re-entry back into the United States when immigration is opened up again. All right, so these family members will come back eventually because they have dependents already living in the United States. All right, so there really is not much of a point for the repatriation program. All right, the idea is to make more jobs available for Anglo-Americans, but in reality, it's just costing the government more money. All right, and putting more of a strain on these relief programs.